want to say something about Trenton, Florida. I grew up in Gainesville, and there's a very strategic benefit to Trenton. It was across the county line, and Alachua was a dry county. So Trenton has, not for me, of course, but I had a lot of friends who drove over there for that reason. I am going to talk to you about some legal issues. I'll try not to put you to sleep. It's tough coming up late in the day before JXM. Amazing presentation. Just wait till you see it. But I do some volunteer work in public schools, and I spoke to a class of high school advanced placement science students about regulatory, permitting issues. And when I was done, I was standing there talking to the teacher, and a young man walked up and he said, "So you're a lawyer?" And I said, "Yep, I'm a lawyer." He says, "You weren't nearly as boring as I expected you to be." So I had to think about that one for a minute. Anyway, this is a statement from the National Research Council from a few years ago. You've heard reference to it, and that is the extremes changing. We have more intense storms, we have drier droughts. What this statement really says is you can't assume that the fluctuations in the climate are happening around a center average, or that things will ever go back to the way they were. And without reading this statement, I don't like to read when I'm talking, you have to manage the resource for the worst drought, for the worst flood, and of course there'll be times in between. What I think this writer was trying to say is nobody knows what's going to happen. But a lot of people are expecting that the old averages are just not reliable anymore. Two schools of thought: climate change mitigation and climate change adaptation. Excuse me. Mitigation is the concept of taking steps to reduce the climate change intensity or even to turn it back. Things like changing internal combustion engines to electric cars or whatever. A lot of the resources out there, a lot of the authors I've looked at, don't believe that that's going to make enough of a difference to be really worth a huge amount of effort. It's more important that we get used to adapting to what's happening. Adaptive management, I know, is something that planners understand a lot better than I do, but adaptive management is going to be critical as we move forward. And I'm going to talk about adaptation today. With the conditions changing, regulatory agencies are going to have a lot of interesting issues to deal with. And I'm very much a permitting lawyer. It's what I live for. When I see a project with 28,000, how many acres? 28,000 acres? Oh man, would I love to get the permitting job for that. But in any event, the temperature changes, and you've heard this today, I'll go through it pretty quickly, but temperature change impacts on water bodies are going to happen. When the temperature changes in the water body, the biota that rely on that water body may be affected. One situation I'm involved in has to do with a spring that is putting out nitrates, basically, and it's backing up with vegetation. This particular spring is a winter shelter for manatees, and we're working with the municipalities in the area to find other ways of getting water for future growth other than pumping the groundwater, because that just exaggerates the problem. It's a really fun project, frankly. Fragmentation, we've heard that today. Fragmentation of the regulatory system in the sense that the upland folks, Water Management District, and I do a lot of work with the water management districts, and I respect them very much, don't get me wrong, but they tend to look at the immediate area. The regulatory criteria are asking applicants to say, what will the impact be, both pre-development and post-development, for example. They don't really think too much about, well, what happens to the estuary? And that kind of fragmentation cannot go on. We have to begin looking at the entire watershed in order to really understand the impacts of what's going on upstream. The essential public services, as I see it, are pretty obvious: potable water, stormwater, and wastewater treatment. Scenario one, let's talk about a shift to a drier climate. All right, what happens during the drought? Groundwater gets stressed. In some parts of the state, for example, a Central Florida coordination area, it's now the Central Florida Water Initiative. It's where St. John's District, South Florida District, and Southwest District all come together. And it's basically the groundwater resource is maxed out. There isn't any more groundwater to be had. And what they're looking at are what are alternative water supplies, even doing desal on the coast and piping it in. That's way too expensive, by the way. With drought and sea level rise, and I didn't realize Miami was already having flooded streets, but they probably have the biggest problem in the near term, and their water supply is going to be overcome with more and more salt water coming inland. And there's an interesting dialogue that I won't get into about what about the Everglades when the salt water reaches the dike on the other side of the Florida Turnpike. The current law allows coastal areas to come inland. Yes, sir. Oh, I could hear me fine. Sorry about that. The current law allows coastal areas to come inland and get water and pump it back to their home base. If it's within the same water management district, and I think that's the next slide here, but the water management district can, by its own action, make a decision to allocate inland water to the coastal area. If it goes between two water management districts, it's called an inter-district transfer, and that gets a lot more complicated, and lawyers get a lot more excited about it, probably because it gets a lot more complicated. This is a section of the Water Resources Code that talks about the flexibility the water management districts have to go outside of county boundaries. And one theme you will see in the state statute is that local governments don't have a whole lot to say about where the water goes. I'm not saying that's the right thing, I'm just saying that's the way the statute is. No local government shall adopt or enforce any law, ordinance, rule, regulation, or order to the contrary, that is, moving the water where the board says it needs to go. Now, when you get into inter-district transfer, you have to file an application in the area where the water's coming from, and concurrently an application in the area in which the water will be used. In determining if the application is consistent with the public interest, the Water Management District is required to look at the population growth projections as developed under Chapter 163. So you guys are critical to deciding where the water needs to go in that sense in particular. If the proposed inter-district transfer is approved, the permit will be issued, and the Water Management District with jurisdiction issues what's called a preliminary notice of agency action. This is more of this good process. They tell you, here's what we think we're going to do. Then they have a hearing. You can come to the hearing and make yourself known. They will then act. If you disagree, assuming you have standing, which is another issue, but if you disagree, you can petition for review before DEP. If there is a petition filed, DEP makes the final decision. This is a little bit inconsistent with the original intent behind the Florida Model Water Code, which was to make the regional water management districts almost, well, not autonomous, but have the primary say in how water is allocated and managed. Under this current governor, DEP is getting a lot of focus, and the state is getting a lot of attention. I don't think that's going to go anywhere in the long run, but this is the way the statute is set up now, and there's nothing wrong with it, of course. But the procedure is to effect the legislative intent to provide a single, efficient, simplified, coordinated permitting process for the interdistrict transfer and use of groundwater. So I ask, is this process more efficient? Is it simpler? No. I'll have to do a few of these before I can really tell you how it works. So we'll see. This is important. The state hereby preempts any regulation of interdistrict transfer of water, period. End of discussion. If after the final approval of the actual water resource transfer, the site for the hardware, if you will, has to be rezoned, then a rezoning application can be filed. If the local authorities deny the application, it goes to the Florida Land and Water Adjudicatory Commission, which is the governor and cabinet. Now, folks, if you've ever been to the circus, you might have seen something that approximates, and I'm on tape, so I better be careful here, but governor and cabinet hearings are quite interesting. Leave it that way. The Land and Water Adjudicatory Commission can, in fact, say we're overruling the local zoning and we're going to grant them a variance. It shall. It shall. It's pretty startling, direct language. So I'm not sure when you read that closely, what's the point of going to the governor and cabinet other than to get them to just say, we'd like a variance, and sit down. That's a terrible, terrible system for lawyers. It cuts out all the interesting arguments. This is some more language about the Chapter 373 permit trumps the DRI statute, the Comprehensive Planning Growth Management Act, and Chapter 381, which has something to do with water and sewer. I'm not real familiar with it. But basically, it controls all. If a unit of government applying for the permit is denied, they may appeal to the Land and Water Adjudicatory Commission. This is a kind of a repetitious part of the statute. I think we'll just move through this rather than get bogged down. All right, let's go the other direction. It gets wet, rains a lot. We got water backing up. We have too much drainage to handle. What happens with a sanitary wastewater treatment plant when the discharge is supposed to be into a tributary, and that tributary now is backed up, and the water is pooling up, and there's no place for it to go? Can you just keep running the plant? Maybe that's a little far-fetched, but that's the sort of thing that you as planners need to think through. What's going to happen if we have these tremendous floods, and how will the infrastructure work to serve the public? Can upstream governments dump their excess stormwater on downstream governments? Now, being in Polk County, you could put a lot of water in the Peace River, and the communities downstream won't have any problems. But even the Peace River doesn't have inexhaustible capacity. And there's law in Florida to the effect that you're not supposed to do this. Even if you comply with the Water Management District and the permitting rules, you're not protected necessarily. An appeals court, just this last August, a couple months ago, found that one of these domino effect floods was not a basis for liability against the state college, the St. John State College. What happened there was water pooled up, it broke through the homeowners association system, it broke through a levee at the college and descended on some waterfront owners who apparently had a lot of money and filed a challenge. They sued basically on the part that the college operated the stormwater system in a negligent way. That by law is not a basis to find them liable. That's the decision. This is the case style, we call it, Barnes v. Board of Trustees. If anybody wants a copy of the case, give me your card, I'll send it to you. There's some more on immunity from liability under Chapter 373. So the water management districts and the other entities that run the drainage facilities may be protected by sovereign immunity. That's been waived for some tort actions, but this case basically says, nah, the waiver of sovereign immunity is not appropriate in this context. So that's something you'll want to stay on top of. These are the things you can do without waiving that protection. What else can be done? We've talked about today stricter enforcement of floodplain management, no build zones. That may be a tough decision, and I realize that the applications for variance to build in floodplains goes to usually a board of commissioners who may have other drivers in their arena, but frankly, it doesn't make any sense to be allowing development in floodplains. And if you love your wetlands, like Mark tells us to do, you'll not want to do that anyway. I mentioned public education here. I think that's a major, major issue that planners and others need to worry about, is how do we get people to understand this is not a joke. Now, there's still some folks out there that are saying, you know, this is just an undulation in geologic time. Well, no. There's too much scientific evidence that says the patterns really have changed. And look at Miami and you've got proof. Legal considerations. Now, I have a lengthy discussion of case law here. But I don't want to get in the way of JX. You all have been very patient. I'll try to move it along. Natural resources versus Kemp Thorne. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service issued a biological opinion, or BIOP, which was held invalid because it assumed that water flows would follow past patterns. This is a really interesting case. Fish and Wildlife Service, you cannot find a no jeopardy conclusion and issue a no-take letter if you don't consider the potential variations in flows. I mean, I'm not sure what they're supposed to assume, but this is the law in the Eastern District of California. Pacific Coast Fishermen's versus Gutierrez, same thing. You didn't think about changes in the climate. Therefore, the biological opinion was arbitrary and capricious. South Yuba River Citizens League, same thing. So you can see, here's a Center for Biological Diversity, the CBD. There was information in the record highlighting the potential effect of climate change in the region, and this is an Arizona case. What I'm hearing is that Arizona and that part of the country is headed for a drier. We looked for it. We looked at the administrative decisions. We looked at the case decisions from courts. Nothing. I have a very good research helper who understands how to do computer research a lot better than I ever will. And when she comes in and says, there's nothing there, it ain't there. However, we've still got Chapter 163. God bless us, we've got Chapter 163. Here's some of the places where I think you could start talking about climate change in the context of Chapter 163. The sanitary sewer, solid waste, drainage, potable water, and natural groundwater recharge element. It says, look at ways to provide future potable water, drainage, sanitary sewer, and so forth. Conservation element, I think that kind of speaks for itself. The intergovernmental coordination element. And this is important here. You've heard it once before today about coalitions and working together. And I think as we begin to see more and more of the effects of climate change, that local governments are going to need to start working together on regional solutions, that nobody can do it by themselves. Tampa Bay Water has an enormous reservoir. They also have a desalination plant. That wasn't built all by a few local governments. There's a lot of state money in that. As a sidelight, my understanding is the desal plant's running at about 4 MGD. It's supposed to be 25, expandable to 35. They're doing that just to keep the membranes from going bad. They're just basically, it's expensive water and they don't want it in the system. Climate monitoring and data, critical. You guys don't have the resources to contract for a lot of data collection, and we need it. So how do you get it? One of the sources I reviewed talked about uses of non-government organizations, NGOs, environmental groups, citizen groups. The only issue there would be how reliable is the data. You have to make sure that when you're collecting data over a broad spectrum of sources that it's reliable, but it's a thought. Your elements, and one last kind of shot at Chapter 163, virtually every element of the statute can be tied to climate change in one way or another. Maybe housing, I don't know, but certainly where you put housing is going to be important. Next steps, I'm going to sound like, I've been over there asleep, which is not true, but I wanted to get to this. The Charlotte Harbor National Estuary Program, with all due respect, Mark, you're probably involved in this, but they get a big grant to study coastal climate change issues. Y'all need some of that money here. And this organization may be a vehicle to pursue that. I'm not saying to go out and start burning torches and having tiki torch and pitchfork parties, but I tend to get those when I do a rezoning case for some reason. Maybe it's me. We need to spend more money inland because when things really turn to doo-doo in the coastal areas, everybody's going to say, well, and somebody said it earlier, they're all going to come inland. So plans are going to be critical. Now, I'm going to go through this last series of slides pretty quickly. These regional projects that we've been alluding to, they may qualify under a new law that was signed by Congress, passed by Congress and signed by the President this past summer. It's called the Water Resource Reform and Development Act, or WRDA. And within WRDA, there's the Water Infrastructure Finance and Innovation Act, or WIFIA. It took me a couple of readings to get used to the acronyms, but WIFIA is going to make federally backed loans and credit arrangements available for these types of projects: flood damage reduction, restoration of aquatic ecosystems, improvements to inland and intercoastal waterways, wastewater treatment works, desalination plants, and so forth. And the acquisition of property can be included. Eligibility requirements, I'm not going to get into this much, but you have to show you're credit worthy. There's also a big public-private initiative within the law. It encourages public-private participation. That's credit-worthy stuff. Selection criteria are quite lengthy in the Act. But as you can see, a lot of these things you may be able to get accomplished right here, except for the support. Well, maybe the support of international commerce, too. Who knows? Regulations are going to be adopted by the U.S. EPA and the Corps of Engineers to implement WIFIA. I talked to the Corps a couple of weeks ago, and they're saying, like, well, it's going to be a while. But keep your eyes peeled. They'll make some announcements about it. I'll be looking for it too. But those rules are going to determine how this statute is actually applied, and they'll be very important. I also got the word from the agencies that until Congress actually appropriates the money, they're not going to do a whole lot. And that's part of what the reality is in Washington these days. So this is what they're talking about allocating to administer the act. I mean, that's a good start, but even at its build out at $50 million, that's really not much money. It'd be a lot for me, but not for the kind of work we're talking about at a national scale. So, can we plan for climate change adaptation under current Florida law and policy? I'd say yeah, but we need a whole lot of tools and more authorization to do as much as we need to do. And I thank you very much. That's all.
So far have talked about the changes, impacts on floodplains, storm levels, increased rainfall, that sort of thing. And I know the vast majority of us are planners. Some of us dabble in engineering from time to time. But when we talk about 25-year and 100-year, and we talk about a 100-year floodplain and a 100-year storm and that sort of thing, one of the areas that it sounds like should be addressed, and I started thinking about this when you were talking about the legal ramifications of a failure and the immunity that some state agencies, but certainly private development, won't have that type of an immunity. So if they're designing to current standards, if the retention and detention facilities in a major development are designed to current standards, but there's a breach, there's a failure, and it's based on a change in climate change, where should we be thinking about going now in terms of modifying design standards? All our roadway elevations, all our stormwater systems, all our retention detention ponds are based on certain criteria at 25, 100-year, whatever storm level. We have a couple of 100-year back-to-back storms, and we got real problems already. And if it's going to intensify, how do we start to design what is the worst case? You designed for the worst possible case, but what is the worst possible case under those circumstances?
If you design for a 100-year storm, you have to ask, what's the 100-year storm? That's going to be more water as we go forward than it is now. As far as what you do with the existing systems, I just don't think there's much you can do with what's already out there. But the agencies could look at more flexible or even more stringent storage requirements as just in case. And I can see that becoming a big issue in regulatory reviews. Well, you're asking us to commit our land for something that may or may not happen. And I think the answer is yeah, because you really don't have a choice.